So we're going to continue with the functions, the physiology of the nephron. After filtration comes reabsorption, and the reabsorption happens in the tubes, so it's called tubular reabsorption. The tubes are epithelium, so it's transepithelial processes. There's passive processes and there's active processes, and it's the way that we get the water, the ions, and the organic nutrients to come back. And we can control that all hormonally. There's two ways that it goes through. It either goes through the cells or it goes between the cells. So we'll talk about that. So when something goes through the cells, the transcellular route, it passes from the lumen of the tube through the apical membrane of the tubular cells, through the cytoplasm of the tubular cells, then out through the basal membrane of those cells, and then through the endothelium of the peritubular capillaries to get back into the blood. So it's a bit of a complicated route, and there can be passive or active processes that do it. And if it goes between the cells, it happens where there are tight junctions that are leaky. A lot of water passes this way, and with it some of the ions like calcium and potassium, magnesium. Not so much sodium, because sodium goes with the sodium-potassium pump in a transcellular way. So this is just a picture of it. So it either passes between the cells or through the cells. Really, the most important thing here of reabsorption is the reabsorption of sodium. It's by far the most abundant ion, cation, in the blood plasma and therefore in the filtrate. It's done with an ATPase pump, a sodium-potassium pump, and its primary active transport. What happens, though, is that the sodium-potassium pump isn't on the luminal side of the cells. It's actually on the basal side of the cells. There are sodium channels that are open to facilitate the diffusion through the luminal side. It ends up being involved with the flow of everything else because it changes osmosis. So what happens is, by actively transporting sodium, we create an osmotic gradient that means that other things get reabsorbed by what's called secondary active transport. It's being dragged along by the sodium. An analogy would be this: if you own a bar and you want to sell beer, you realize that the number one consumers of beer, like the customer that you want in your bar, are males between 19 and 26 years of age. What's going to get those guys into your bar are women between 19 and 26 years of age. And when women go out, they like to go dancing. So what's going to get women into your bar is a good DJ and a good dance floor. So by providing the DJ and you're going to get women in your bar. So that would be primary active transport. You're paying to get, you're creating the energy to get the women into the bar. And then the young men come into the bar because there are women there. That is the secondary active transport. So it's the same thing is going on here. If I pump sodium out of the filtrate and into the peritubular capillaries, then what's going to happen is there's now going to be osmosis that is going to be drawing water and anything dissolved in the water into those peritubular capillaries and out of the filtrate because of osmosis. Now, most of the things that actually have to come across, though, need a carrier mechanism, some sort of either a facilitated channel or a carrier protein that will get things across. And what this means is that there are things called transport maximums. Like no matter how much glucose is in the filtrate, there's only a maximum amount that can be transported across and reabsorbed into the blood. So that's why people with diabetes and high blood sugars have high sugars in the filtrate. They reach their transport maximum, and the glucose ends up being expelled in urine. The excess glucose is expelled in urine, which is why the urine is sweet, which is why it's called diabetes mellitus, which means honey pees a lot. So the water is reabsorbed by osmosis. I think last semester I talked to you about osmosis, and if in doubt, and if you want to know how water is moved, it's by osmosis. There are pores that aid the water passing called aquaporons. And then it drags things through that are that can get through with the water. So it's basically this. There's a sodium-potassium pump. You pump the sodium here, which means there's less sodium here, which means sodium diffuses through this channel here. And so now there's higher osmosis there, so water and glucose and a bunch of things follow. Because then the sodium-potassium pump will pump sodium out here, potassium back in. Potassium then leaks back out through potassium leakage channels. It ends up creating an osmotic gradient here that allows this paracellular route to work. Chlorine and a lot of water passes through this way. This number 4 is an aquaporon. This is the way that water gets through, because water can't pass the lipid bilayer very well, so it needs a channel that will facilitate that, an aquaporon. Now, in the early part of the tubules, the aquaporons are open all the time. Later in the tubules, we're going to see that they open and close based on hormones. They're hormonally controlled. And so we can control how much water gets reabsorbed, making either dilute or concentrated urine, depends on what the body needs. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, like right after we leave the Bowman's capsule, is where most of the reabsorption happens. 65% of sodium and water gets reabsorbed there. Virtually all the nutrients get reabsorbed there, so that all the glucose, all the amino acids, all of that. Almost all the other ions get brought back that way, and any small proteins that have escaped or need to get reabsorbed will happen at this proximal convoluted tubule. So by the time the filtrate leaves the proximal convoluted tubule and ends up in the loop of Henle, it is basically stuff that's not been reabsorbed. So it's water, sodium, so it's the 35% of the water and 35% of the sodium, a little bit of potassium, and all of the waste products like urea and creatinine and things like that, stuff that will not ever get reabsorbed. So in the descending limb, the thin portion, there are aquaporons, so water gets reabsorbed in the loop of Henle. And in the ascending limb, the thick portion of the loop of Henle, there are sodium-potassium pumps that that cause the reabsorption of more sodium. In the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, there are carriers. There is facilitated diffusion, aquaporons, and calcium channels, and actually active transport of both calcium and sodium that are controlled hormonally. So PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, turns on calcium pumps in the distal convoluted tubule and causes you to reabsorb more calcium than you normally would in the case of when the blood needs more calcium. If calcium levels are high in the blood, then we don't release parathyroid hormone. Osteoclastic activity goes down, but these calcium pumps turn off. The aquaporons, aquaporin 2s in these distal and collecting ducts, open in the presence of antidiuretic hormone. That's the hormone that makes you not pee. It will raise your blood pressure, so we release this at low blood pressure or dehydration. Sodium potassium pumps are turned on by aldosterone or inhibited by atrial natriuretic peptide. So we can hormonally control the sodium potassium pumps there. So aldosterone makes you reabsorb more sodium. Atrial natriuretic peptide, as the word says, it comes from the heart and causes you to not absorb as much sodium and makes you pee more sodium. Natriuretic. So the aldosterone collecting ducts and the distal convoluted, and there are sodium potassium pumps that are involved with this. It turns them on. So now tubular secretion is the opposite of this tubular reabsorption. And basically, stuff gets reabsorbed inappropriately. Things like potassium, acidity, so hydrogen ions, NH4 is ammonia, creatinine. A lot of these things end up leaving the filtrate by this sodium drag, by this secondary active transport, and end up back in the blood where we don't want it. So we secrete it. We basically do absorption in reverse, and we put it back into the tubule, back into the urine. And so it's a way of disposing of stuff, of undesirable substances. The most important regulatory thing of this is potassium. And basically, when we're reabsorbing sodium, we are secreting potassium because the sodium potassium pump works that way. By bringing sodium back into the blood, we put potassium out, which gives us an interesting thing. When we tell people that they have to go on low sodium diets, they often substitute with salt substitutes, which are often high in potassium, and so they salt just as much. They just use potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride. And then when it gets to their kidneys, they have to get rid of the potassium by reabsorbing sodium, and so they end up with high sodium anyways. Tubular secretion is also responsible for maintaining acid-base balances, which we will talk about in class, by eliminating bicarbonate ions out into the urine, by secreting them into the urine.